In this talk we want to deal with the organisation of sales activity. Sales management consists of a large range of activities. The purpose is to ensure that the sales team are efficient and working towards meeting corporate goals. Clearly it's important for the sales management team to meet its goals because that's what generates the revenue that keeps the company going. Without sales revenue, the company will have costs only. Costs only means the company will not exist. It will not be commercially viable. So sales revenue are essential. Profits, don't forget, are just the difference between sales revenue and costs. So the responsibility for sales management is considerable in the existence of the business. The sales organisation must adopt a sales structure. They must organise the sales team and activities, and they must do it in a way which is structured and targeted at the market. This will ensure that the sales team are efficient. They must have a structure. They must have it written down. They must have a schema which shows who is responsible for what, where will they be located, the training program they must go through, their knowledge of the market, their knowledge of the product, their personal attributes and how applicable they are to achieving the targets, their ability to travel, their ability to meet customers, their personalities. All sorts of considerations come into play. And it's important that the organisation cultivate the sales team by making sure they've got sufficient training and sufficient motivation and sufficient rewards to compensate them for this incredible effort they're making to keep the business alive by generating sales revenue. Because in effect that is what is happening. They are the people who are generating the sales revenue that keeps the business going. So the sales management are responsible for managing the sales force and sales activity. So generally speaking, in medium-sized businesses to large businesses, there will be a sales director or a marketing director perhaps, and under the marketing director there will be a sales team, a sales manager and perhaps other managers related to sales, depending on the size of the organisation, depending on the number of sales and the complexity of the sales effort. But the sales management team and the sales manager in particular will have responsibility for managing the sales force and ensuring that they are effective and they operate effectively in the marketplace. Now, organising the sales activity. Well, sales management must consider the following when planning sales activity. They must look at the size of the sales force. How big is the sales force? Perhaps one manager can't look after all of them. It may need deputy managers or associate managers, or it may need another layer of management with delegation to look after certain aspects of the sales force, perhaps looking after their presence in the field. If it involves travelling, looking after them when travelling and making sure that they have the resources and the contacts and the communications and so on. So the size of the sales force will be conditional on the size of the company, the size of the market, the complexity of the product, and those sort of considerations. But also looking at the territory in which they're selling. The territory may be geographically distant, it may be another country, or it may be part of the same country but in a much different area. They need to have the demographics of the area well worked out. Is the area improving or declining? Is it attracting new investment, or is it in recession? What's the social conditions in the area, and so on. So they must look at the territory and design out where they want to be. And a lot of this is to do with what we call the workload approach. What is the workload of the sales force? Now, the easiest way to gauge this type of approach is by looking at more traditional selling methods. For example, let's say almost a call center type situation, where the efforts of the sales staff can be measured against certain metrics. It can be looked at in terms of the number of calls made or the number of calls efficiently answered and the number of sales made and so on. So the workload approach is not applicable in all cases. It only applies in certain situations where metrics can be collected, when it's possible to count up the number of calls or the number of calls received or the time spent talking to customers, or where metrics can be used. For some sales efforts, it may require face-to-face contact. It may require a more gentle approach, a more personal approach, a more affable, chatty approach with the customer to allay the customer's fears about buying the product or spending considerable sums of money on acquiring the product, reassuring the customer of after-sales service and the quality of the product and so on. So the sales activity can, of course, range over a wide area depending on the nature of the product, depending on the nature of the business. But the sales manager should also, in some cases, look after journey planning. They should be able to work out the most efficient ways of getting their staff into the field and back home at the end of the day, or look for suitable accommodation if they can't travel back home. So there's an element of planning within the organization to ensure that the people involved are looked after. Back to the call center approach. Well, looking at call frequencies, as I said, if metrics can be used, if measurements can be used, then perhaps call frequency, calls answered and so on, and the sales manager might want to look at that. Now, the sales force size. Well, the size of the sales force is an important factor when organizing the sales activity. As the organization grows and sales output increases, the sales force should also increase. It may not be pro rata, but it certainly should increase, because the importance of sales should not diminish as the organization grows. The importance of sales are just as important later as they were at the start. Nothing should be taken for granted. The customers should not be taken for granted. Sales managers must identify a need for additional sales people and assess whether the organization has sufficient resources to recruit and train additional staff. It's not just a question of taking on workers and asking them to become sales representatives. They need to be trained, and resources need to be put into their training, and they need experience. They may need to shadow existing sales staff to see how it's done. Then perhaps they may go through a long period in which they are not producing. They are being trained, they're watching and learning. And the organization must make sure it's got the resources to do that. Now, this workload approach I mentioned earlier, well, that's probably the most common method to determine the size of the workforce. It only applies in certain situations. It only applies under certain circumstances. It's an effort on the part of some people to try and quantify the workload of the salespeople. As I said, it depends critically on the nature of the product and the type of sales efforts that are required in certain markets. So it only applies in certain circumstances. Nonetheless, let's have a look at it. The workload approach. Well, the workload approach is as I said, it's a quasi-scientific approach which is used to identify how many additional salespeople should be employed. Bearing in mind, it does apply to more so situations where quantitative data can be collected. It's a formula which analyzes call frequency and the number of sales made to achieve a sale. So in terms of call centers, this could be a way of looking at the call center and to see the efficiency of the call center. Performance indicators must be established, and this is referred to as the call norm. So within a call center, there must be performance indicators. What is good and what is bad? People must be judged on what is a good performance or what's a bad performance. So there must be something, and that performance indicator is called the norm. This is the norm. This is what we would expect. For example, the number of sales calls that have to be made in order to achieve a sale. So if a person in a call center is making lots of calls and not selling anything, then they are not conforming to the norm. Perhaps 1 in every 5 calls should generate a sale. 1 in every 20 calls should generate a sale. Perhaps that's the norm. So if an operator is making 50 calls and not selling anything, it's not conforming to the norm. As I said, bear in mind right throughout this part, when looking at the workload approach, this applies to areas where quantitative data can be collected and can be analyzed, and norms can be established. Quantitative norms can be established to judge it. A lot of sales effort in the field will be face-to-face. It will be dealing with people. It will be talking to people, and it must not be rushed, and it must not be the customer must not feel that they're being slotted in and they've got a certain time period to talk. Otherwise, they must feel relaxed and comfortable for a lot of situations to work. So this workload approach applies to areas where quantitative information can be collected, standardized, norms established, and so on. Let's look at it. Now, the standard formula, well, would you believe that looks like the standard formula? I'm not going to really go through it, but it's the number of existing customers plus the potential customers, so the total number of customers, existing and potential, times the frequency of calls, how many times are calls made to those people, times the length of the call, how long does the call length last on average, and all divided by the ideal selling time available for a salesperson, and that gives you the number of salespeople required. It was developed by 2 academics in the area, and it's an effort at trying to quantify sales. But by and large, as I said, and I keep saying, sales activities must be related to the product, the type of customer that's going to be in the market for that product, what the competitors are doing, the area where the product is sold, the price of the product. It's related to a lot of factors. So an effort like this, it's interesting, but I'm not too sure if it applies universally or applies in many areas. Now, call frequency. Let's have a look at some of the points related to the formula nonetheless. The call frequency refers to the amount of calls made to customers to achieve a sale. The salespeople tend to make calls to new customers in order to achieve a sale, or existing customers to build a strong relationship. So calls can be for 2 reasons. And the sales managers need to assess the frequency and appropriateness of these calls. Sales call can be either in person or by telephone. So they could actually go out and see the person. How long does it take? How much time, how much resource does it take in traveling, in time, and so on. or is it done by telephone, and what's the most suitable medium for contacting the customer? Making calls too often can have a negative impact on the organisation and salespeople. Sometimes calls are referred to as nuisance calls and ignored. Making infrequent calls can potentially lose customers to competitors. So there's a balance to be struck. If customers are not called enough, competitors can step in and take the customers. And if the customers are called too often, they could be seen as a nuisance. So there's a balance to be struck there. Sales must be planned, and it must be thought out in advance. There must be a schedule, and the schedule must be followed. I think it's probably fair to say in situations where it's not so mechanistic, there is no formula being used, it's the sales team trying to generate sales, there still needs to be a plan, there still needs to be a schedule, and information still needs to be collected and a database used and interrogated to find out what is the patterns of buying behavior, what are the attributes of the customers, what's the characteristics of the area, and some sort of analysis based on that and applied with a plan and given to the sales team. That seems to be an effective way of selling a moderately priced to expensive product. If the product is cheap, and many of them perhaps cheap food items, then perhaps the sales team will be briefed to deal with outlets, deal with shops in the area, and deal with shop owners. And the same principle will apply. They must have a relationship with the shop owner relating to the product. They must talk to the shop owner about the product, its placement in the shop, the markup they will receive, returns, credit facilities, and so on. So there are many issues to be dealt with there. Sales managers can allocate a list of customers who need to be contacted. So if a plan does exist, which it should, then the sales manager can allocate to the sales team which customers need to be contacted. And they should keep a record of which member of the sales team contacted the customer, so that the customer and that salesperson will have spoken many times, and there will be the feeling on the customer's part that he or she knows the salesperson, and through the salesperson knows the business and knows the product. And the sales frequency or the call frequency can be determined. Customers' importance in regards to sales value can be determined and fed back by a member of the sales team back into the database for future use. And also, repeat purchases can be collected by members of the sales team who will know the customer, what the customers need, the circumstances the customers are working under, and they will know what the customers want. But repeated sales is a good indication of how the customer feels about the product, and that information can be collected and stored and used for future marketing purposes. And the buyer decides how often they prefer to visit or contact sales representatives. So the buyers may, in the course of dealing with the sales team, indicate what is the optimum for them in terms of contact and in terms of time they've got to commit to sales talk and sales meetings. And that could also be fed into the database so that the wishes of the customer are accommodated. Now the sales manager will also have to look at journey planning and making sure that the sales team are able to deal with sales over a long distance and perhaps travel long distances to meet customers or to meet outlets or warehouses or whatever it is they're dealing with. Journey planning is a sales resource used to monitor and review sales activity. So journey planning is important because it indicates where the sales team are putting their effort. But it also enables the sales manager to look after the sales team in the field and to plan their journeys and ensure efficiency and no duplication or replication of efforts on the part of the sales team in that area. So it's a question of making the most out of the resources. Making sales calls takes a lot of time and effort, and journey planning ensures that time can be efficiently managed when making sales calls. The journey time, sometimes the term is used even in terms of making the call, making a phone call. It could be the length of time spent on the phone. Sometimes that's referred to as the journey from getting the customer interested in the product to the final sale. It's a wider journey, but it could be a physical journey. It could be getting members of the sales team to an area and making sure that as I said, there's no overlap in efforts within that area, and that the team are efficiently managed in the area and looked after, indeed. So sales activity needs to take into account factors such as time, traveling to customers, and travel between appointments. So it's looking at the time taken to meet the customers, moving between different appointments, and allowing for issues such as bad communications or bad travel communications, perhaps roads being congested or detours put in place or whatever. So it's a question of managing the sales team subject to all the constraints that are imaginable in these scenarios. And it's for the sales management team to try and effectively deal with this and make sure that the sales team that go to the field, go in to meet the customers directly, have the proper resources to do so. So the management must consider the location and sales territory. Geographical structure consists of salespeople to take sole responsibility for their territory. So sometimes a member of the sales team will look after a particular territory. And this is quite common amongst even confectionery makers or sweet manufacturers and so on. They have a sales management team, an area manager perhaps, with the sales team under the area manager who looks after a particular geographic area. And in that way, outlets within that geographic area relate to that particular sales team or that particular sales person who is a member of the team. And that salesperson will be looked after by the area manager, and the area managers will be looked after by the sales manager, who is looked after perhaps by the marketing director. So there is an organizational structure in facilitating the whole process. And there are also routine administrative tasks that need to be dealt with. For example, doing market research and writing reports about the market. And these take time and take effort away from real selling, from the actual process of selling, but are required for long-term viability in that geographic area. So sometimes sales teams have to take on additional administrative tasks or duties doing some sales research themselves. It may not be scientific sales research. It may be more participant observation, looking at how customers respond to the product, or talking to customers, not in any random fashion, just by convenience, talking to customers who happen to be there about the product and their experience of the product and what they would like to see and so on. And writing reports and sending that back to the area manager, who may collate these reports and write them up as a more detailed report that goes back to the sales management in the business itself. Sales objectives. Well, management should set the objectives to ensure that salespeople are working towards targets and achieving corporate goals. So the salespeople should have a target. They should be motivated to achieve certain targets. Targets must be achievable. It's wrong to set targets that can't be achieved, because the team will not even try. So they should set objectives that are targets that are achievable, and should not be too onerous, but should not be too easy either. There should be a challenge, but achievable. And in that way, the sales team will have pride in themselves. Individual members will have pride when they've achieved their target, but also the company will have some sort of target, and they will know that the sales team are working effectively because they have met the target. Now, communicating with the sales team, well, it's important to have effective communications. It must run all the way through from every part of the sales team, right through to the sales manager, right up to marketing director, if that's the order. It depends on the structure of the business, but there should be a channel of communications, and there should be a channel of support as well, that should the member of the sales team be asked a question that he or she can't answer, that should be answered very quickly. Communications techniques are so readily available and so efficient that it should be possible to contact the base, get an answer back very fast, and satisfy the customer inquiry. So the team should be effective, and there should be effective communications facilitating the effectiveness of the team. Communications plays a key role in forming, persuading and supporting the sales team and sales operations. It keeps the team up to date with each other's activities, what the company is saying and doing at the moment, and it just generally helps that they should be able to communicate, stay in touch. They don't feel alienated or cut off. They feel they're still working within the company, although they themselves may be sitting in their car many miles from the company. They are still a part of the team. Weaknesses in management sales activity will have a negative impact on the sales team, and negative impacts on the sales team may affect morale, which may affect their effectiveness in the market. They may not be able to deal with customers effectively because they are disengaged, because they're not being communicated with, they're not being kept in the loop, they're not being informed. They feel somewhat alienated and cut off from the process. So effective communications, very important. There are all sorts of methods that are available: emails, mobiles, video conferencing, all sorts that can be used. So it's easy, if the will is there, to have good communications between the sales team and the base. Something we haven't mentioned is sales manuals. Well, it's a good way of communicating with the sales team. A sales manual is a booklet or a book of the products, their attributes, their technical specifications, their components, and so it's a good reference book. It provides good communications and information about the product and about the features of the product. Sales manuals are reference documents that salespeople can use to guide them through the sales call. Sales manuals are used as a form of training and briefing. They're not really marketing documents as such. They're not attractive. They are ensuring that the salesperson has detailed knowledge of the product, has good understanding of the technical specifications, what the product can do, what needs it will address, and how it will address those needs. So it turns the salesperson into an expert in the product, and it will deal with perhaps any questions that the customer may pose, and perhaps the salesperson hasn't got the answer immediately to hand, but they can get it through the sales manual. Sales bulletins are another form of communication, particularly useful when salespeople are not in regular contact with management. So sales bulletins are updates on the product, on the thinking of the business. There could be briefing to the sales team from the sales manager if the sales team haven't been back to base for some time. And sometimes companies may have sales teams working in different countries and on a permanent basis, so they need to be kept briefed as to what the company is thinking and the product and developments in the product and changes to the product and so on. So sales bulletins provide up-to-date information about current issues concerning the organisation and details about sales meetings and what was said and what's agreed and sales plans and proposals for innovations and so on. And it keeps the sales teams, members of the sales teams, informed. It keeps them all on the same proverbial page. Sales bulletins are used in intranets of the organisation. Intranets are good ways of disseminating the information, but they may be printed off as printed documents and sent out as printed documents, perhaps once every 6 months or whatever, and updated with additional sheets over a period of time. But the most immediate and most efficient way of doing it is through intranets. And there may be facilities for people to access intranets through virtual private networks, VPNs. But there may be ways in which the members of the sales team in quite distinct separated markets may be able to access the intranet of the organisation technically. Failing that, as I said, a paper document with updates and with major revisions perhaps every 6 months or every year, depending on the product or depending on the policy of the business. Of course, sales meetings are very useful as a way of communications and a way of binding the teams together. This is where members of the team sit around and have formal meetings with minutes and get to talk about their concerns and what they feel, and they're able to feed back their experiences from dealing with customers, and this is a good way of recording what happens at the meetings, and issues for follow-up can be identified and action points against certain individuals who perhaps need to follow up on certain things and report back at the following meeting. So sales meetings are, generally speaking, a good idea. The sales meeting, however, bear in mind, takes people away from the selling effort and does have a resource cost. But the sales meeting usually have regular updates, feedbacks. They assess the progress of changes that were proposed, and they monitor the sales team. So sales meetings can be a very informative platform for the analysis of the performance of the team, looking at issues, looking at problems, and addressing those, perhaps, as I said, by allocating action points to certain individuals to deal with certain issues and report back at the next meeting. So there is a responsibility allocated at the meeting for some individuals to deal with certain things. So it's a good way of moving the situation forward. Sales meetings can be one-to-one. So a sales meeting doesn't have to be a group of people sitting around. It may be the sales manager and one member of the team having a meeting about some issue, something that was identified perhaps by the member of the sales team, customer comments or customers' requirements, or it may be that the member of the sales team seeks clarification on certain issues. The meeting could be formal or informal. Formal meetings are often classed as sales conferences involving larger groups of sales staff and management. But it could be one-to-one, as I said. It could be the sales manager and a single member of the team. A sales meeting takes time to arrange and can be costly. As I said earlier, it's not resource-free. So if salespeople are being taken out of the field, out of the immediate contact with the customers to have a meeting, then sales may be lost in that period. Sales meetings are not costless. So they have to be used effectively. They have to be properly planned and they have to be properly scheduled. There can't be just casual meetings taking up time, people sitting around chatting. They're there to do a particular job and they must do it effectively. So it should be arranged and planned with a clear agenda. And the salespeople should be aware of the contents of the meeting before they turn up. So the agenda should be circulated in advance so that people turning up to the meeting know what's going to be discussed and have points ready to make and illustrations to make regarding points. And so they are more briefed, and that will make for a better meeting where the individuals are prepared to make a better contribution. Clear objectives of the meeting should be communicated. For example, if the meeting has been called to look at training or planning or looking at feedback from customers or whatever it is, then the meeting should have a clear objective. There could be a review meeting, which is a more open meeting, but generally speaking, meetings should be called that are focused on certain points, and the sales team who turn up to the meeting should know in advance what those points, the points that will be discussed will be, and they should be ready to make contributions on those topics so that the meeting is more productive. Now, these are some of the issues relating to sales. As you can see, it's not straightforward. It's not as simple as just getting a product and going out and selling it. It's a question of looking at the size of the organization, the complexity of the organization, the complexity of the product, the structure of the business, how the business is structured, and what sort of support the team can get if there is a team. If it's a small business, it may be just one person who works as a sales representative doing his or her best to try and promote the business. So it can vary. And I suppose as students of this area, it's for us to look at particular cases and take out of this what is appropriate for that particular case. But that's all I'm going to do on this topic for the moment, so we're going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.